Elijah Boone had never been a man of many words, nor one to chase after much. Life on the edge of the frontier taught him to speak more with his hands than his mouth, and to trust the rhythms of nature over the promises of people. He had lived, for nearly 2 decades, in the wide wind-bent valley between 2 ridges, just him, his horses, his dog, and a slowly aging ranch house, built from his father's own hands. The land was hard, but honest. It never gave anything for free, but it never lied either. That was enough for Elijah. He had been alone since his parents passed, since the townsfolk stopped coming by, and since the railway took younger men and women elsewhere. He hadn't minded. He grew his own vegetables, kept his animals in good health, and carved out a life that, while lonely, was still full of purpose. But time wears on even the strongest shoulders, and one evening, as the fire crackled and the silence thickened, Elijah felt the weight of his solitude pressing too close to the bone. That's when he started writing letters. Not just to anyone. He had answered a listing in the back of an old homesteader's paper, seeking correspondence with gentlemen of character, must appreciate quiet books and the outdoors. The handwriting was neat, the name simply signed Clara. The first few letters were cautious, like 2 people feeling out the edges of each other's hearts. But slowly, a warmth began to build like kindling, finally catching fire. Clara lived back east, the widow of a schoolteacher, and was weary of city noise and factory smoke. Her words carried thoughtfulness, humor, and a strange familiarity that made Elijah feel young again. They exchanged letters for a full year. Through them, Elijah told her about the sound of elk at dawn, the smell of the earth after a long rain, and the comfort of evening shadows rolling across the land like a blanket. Clara spoke of her love for storytelling, her longing for open skies, and her dream of a place where roots could be planted again. One day, her letter arrived with only 5 words written in bold script: "I will come to you." Now, on this spring morning, Elijah stood near the front gate of his ranch, the wind pressing gently against the old cedar posts. He had cleaned himself up, shaved his beard, and put on the best clothes he owned: his father's wedding coat, a blue shirt he'd only worn once before, and a faded rose tucked into his lapel. It was the kind of nervous preparation he hadn't felt since he was a boy getting ready for his first dance. He'd brushed the dust from the fence, tied a small white ribbon to mark the path from the road, and even trimmed the bushes that had taken over the garden near the porch. The sky was clear, the mountains still wearing snow on their peaks, and the morning air was filled with the scent of pine and promise. All around him, the world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Even the horses stood still in their pens, ears twitching toward the horizon. Elijah's dog, Buck, sat beside him, tail wagging lazily. "You think she like it here, boy?" Elijah asked aloud, more to calm himself than for an answer. Buck let out a low huff and rested his head on Elijah's boot. It was enough. What Elijah didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that the peaceful quiet of this morning would not last. For while he stood there watching the road for a lone wagon and the soft dust it might kick up, something entirely different was stirring beyond the northern ridge. Far off, still out of sight, hundreds of hooves beat against the earth like a distant storm. The sound hadn't yet reached the valley floor, but soon it would. Soon, the silence would break, not with the gentle arrival of a bride's carriage, but with the thundering approach of 400 native warriors riding down into the basin, ancient and proud. Elijah waited with a heart full of hope, but destiny had chosen this day for more than just a wedding. Something much older and far more powerful was coming his way. At first, it was nothing more than a tremor beneath the soles of Elijah's boots, a faint, rhythmic pulse, like the earth itself was breathing. He shifted slightly, thinking it might have been his imagination, or maybe the distant rumble of thunder rolling off the mountains. But the sky was still cloudless, and the wind was gentle. Buck, who had been resting at Elijah's feet, suddenly lifted his head and let out a low, cautious growl. Elijah narrowed his eyes and turned toward the northern ridge, the one with the old pine trees lining its edge like silent sentinels. The valley had always been quiet, save for the occasional storm or a runaway horse. But something about the stillness now felt charged. The birds had stopped their chirping, and the air had a strange electricity to it. He took a step forward and climbed the gatepost to get a clearer view. At first, all he saw was dust, just a rising haze against the line of the horizon. But then the shapes emerged, dark figures on horseback, riding in formation, dozens upon dozens of them. They came like a river of shadows, flowing down from the ridge with a sense of purpose that sent a chill through Elijah's spine. He squinted harder, and that's when he saw it: feathers, paint, and the unmistakable glint of metal ornaments catching the sun. These were warriors, real ones, and not just a few. There were hundreds. The ground beneath the valley began to hum, a steady, pulsing vibration that grew stronger with each passing moment. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't afraid, at least. Not in the way a man fears for his life, but he was stunned, confused. This wasn't a coincidence. This was deliberate, and it was happening on this day, the day Clara was supposed to arrive. His heart began to race. He had heard stories of large gatherings, powwows, and spiritual reunions among the tribes, but not for years, and certainly not in this region. The local bands had been quiet, most of them pushed to reservations or scattered across distant counties. This kind of display, this kind of arrival, had weight. It had meaning. As the riders came closer, Elijah could begin to distinguish more details. Painted horses, war bonnets with trailing feathers, staffs decorated with bones, beads, and fur. Some of the warriors carried ceremonial drums strapped across their backs, others had small pouches and totems hanging from their belts. There was no sign of panic, no yelling or charging. This wasn't an ambush. It was a procession. They moved with eerie precision, hundreds of hooves pounding in unison like a great heart beating across the plain. And yet, through all the motion, there was an unnatural silence to them. No laughter, no cries of greeting, no music, just the relentless rhythm of their approach. Elijah felt a shiver crawl up his neck. His mind raced with questions. Was this a warning, a challenge, a ceremony? Why now, and why here? He climbed down from the fence, his boots hitting the packed dirt with a dull thud. Buck stayed close, his ears pinned back, growling softly but not barking. The dog, like his master, didn't sense danger, just gravity, the kind of ancient weight that presses down when something sacred is unfolding. Elijah walked slowly toward the open space between his barn and the main corral, the area that opened out into the rest of the valley. It was the clearest spot on his land, perfect for viewing the ridge and perfect for being viewed. He removed his hat and held it in both hands, the brim clenched tight between his fingers. He felt the sun on his face and the wind teasing the long grass around him. And for a brief second, he had the strange thought that he was standing not in his own time, but in someone else's dream. Then the first line of warriors broke over. The last rise. It was a sight Elijah would never forget, row after row of mounted figures, their silhouettes etched against the morning light like a living mural. Leading them was a single rider, taller than the rest, with gray braids falling over his shoulders and a long eagle staff in his hand. He didn't shout, he didn't gesture. He just looked directly at Elijah as they descended into the basin. The message was clear, they had come for a reason. And Elijah Boone, rancher, loner, bridegroom in waiting, would soon learn what that reason was. Elijah Boone stood frozen in place, his hat clutched in his calloused hands as the wall of riders drew closer. But his mind, his heart was already racing back through time. Back to memories that had long sat dormant like dust-covered books. On a shelf, he knew these warriors. Not their names, not their faces exactly, but the spirit of them, the weight of their presence, the echo of a connection buried deep in his bones. When Elijah was a boy, long before his beard had grown in and before the valley had become so empty, the world was different. His father, Silas Boone, had not only been a rancher and trapper, but also a man who had lived shoulder to shoulder with the native people of the plains. In the dead of winter, when food was scarce and snow lay thick over the mountains, Silas had once taken in a half-starved Lakota family, an old man, his daughter, and two small boys who had lost their way during a storm. Elijah remembered that winter well. He was only 10 years old, but the fire that burned in the hearth and in the hearts of their guests left a lasting imprint. The old man was named White Cloud. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words came with such clarity and weight that even young Elijah knew to listen. It was White Cloud who taught him to listen to the wind, to move without scaring the deer, and to speak only when the silence had given permission. For 2 winters, the families remained close. They exchanged meat for herbs, language for stories. Elijah learned words in Lakota, basic ones, like Viaka feather, Makokerth, and Tazina blanket. They taught him to respect the land, not just survive on it. Silas never saw them as guests or charity cases. He saw them as neighbors. But the world changed. The railroad crept westward. White settlers brought their own rules, laws, and boundaries. Tribes were pushed out, were cut off from their traditional paths. Tensions flared. The friendships Elijah once knew slipped quietly into the shadows. White Cloud and his family disappeared one summer, headed north, toward safer ground. Elijah never saw them again. He had grown older, taken over the ranch, and told himself that chapter of his life was over. Until now, as the riders spread into a wide formation at the edge of his property, Elijah's breath slowed. The lead rider, the one with gray braids and an eagle staff, brought his horse to a slow halt. Behind him, others did the same, like waves settling after a great tide. Elijah stepped forward, the dust swirling around his boots. The air was thick with tension, not of violence, but of ceremony, like something sacred was unfolding, and he had stumbled into the heart of it. Then the leader dismounted. He was tall and proud, but not young. His eyes were deep-set, lined with the creases of time and wind. He walked forward slowly, one hand extended not in threat, but in greeting. Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat. "You are the son of Silas Boone," the man said, his voice low but steady. "The one who shared food when the snows came." Elijah blinked. 1,000 memories hit him at once. The old firelight, the soft voice of White Cloud, the laughter of two young Lakota boys sharing roasted rabbit. He looked at the man in front of him. Could it be yes? He said quietly, "That was my father. And I remember." The man nodded. "I am White, Cloud's grandson. My name is Kaluta. We did not forget." Elijah was stunned. All this time, he had believed those moments were gone, buried in the past. Yet here, standing before him, was proof that kindness had not disappeared into the void. It had lived on. And now, decades later, it had returned, not just as a memory, but as a movement. But one question still sat heavy on Elijah's chest. Why now? Why had they returned on this day, after all these years? As if reading his mind, Kaluta said, "We came not just for the past. We came for what is about to begin." And with those words, Elijah realized his reunion with Clara would be part of something far greater than a simple wedding. It would become a bridge between generations. Elijah Boone stood beside Kaluta, stunned into stillness as the 400 warriors behind him remained silent and unmoving. The great tide of hooves had settled, but their energy lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. It was a gathering unlike anything Elijah had ever witnessed, and yet the atmosphere was not hostile. It was solemn, reverent, even protective. The sun had risen high over the valley, casting golden light across the grasslands and painting the warriors in a halo of heat and color. Their horses, too, stood still, as if they were part of a larger ceremony. Elijah noticed the deliberate arrangement: elders near the front, younger riders at the flanks, a ring of women and children seated near the outer perimeter, adorned in intricate beadwork and leather. They had not just come to remember something, they had come to witness something. But what exactly? Kaluta gestured for Elijah to walk with him toward the clearing near the barn. As they moved, the crowd made way without a word, opening a path like water around a stone. The moment felt choreographed, like it had been practiced in dreams long before Elijah ever imagined a bride might come to his valley. Once they reached the open space, Kaluta turned toward Elijah and said, "Do you know what today is?" Elijah shook his head, unsure. "I know it's the day my bride was supposed to arrive." The elder nodded solemnly. "Yes, and it is also the anniversary of when your father gave his last bag of flour and the final strips of dried meat to my grandfather. He saved us. Without him, our bloodline would not have continued. Today is the day our people remember." That kindness, Elijah's throat tightened. He had known his father had helped that winter, but he never imagined that simple act would ripple through generations. And now, decades later, it was being honored with the arrival of hundreds. Not with words, but with presence, with memory, with shared ground. Kaluta continued, "We have come not only to honor your father, but to bring you something as well, a blessing, a joining, something old and something new." That was when Elijah heard the sound, the soft creak of wagon wheels. He turned his head and saw, at the far end of the road, a small covered wagon approaching, pulled by a single gray mare. Dust curled around its wheels. A figure sat at the front, wearing a wide hat and holding the reins with careful hands. Clara. His heart leaped. She had come despite the wildness of the scene. Despite the uncertain welcome, she had kept her word. She had come to him, and not alone. Behind her wagon, 2 more wagons followed, each carrying supplies, trunks, books, and bundles wrapped in blankets. But what startled Elijah most was who walked beside the second wagon. A group of native women, dressed in ceremonial clothing, walked in rhythm with the wagons, carrying bundles and bowls, as if they had been invited to a great feast. Children ran alongside them, laughing, their voices high and bright against the stillness of the valley. Kaluta smiled. She did not arrive unaware. She traveled through our lands. She stayed in our homes. She listened to our stories. We brought her here, in a sacred way. Elijah's heart thudded. He had written letters filled with the land, the sky, the past. But Clara had done more than reply. She had entered the story. She had chosen to come not just to him, but to them. As the wagons rolled into the open space, the warriors parted once more, forming a great circle. Kaluta raised his staff, and a hush fell like a soft blanket across the earth. "This is not only a wedding," he said aloud, voice carrying like wind through tall grass. "It is a remembrance, a joining of people once divided, a bond, made not in ink or law but in life, land, and legacy." Elijah stepped forward, heart pounding, as Clara smiled at him from the wagon seat. She wore a simple dress, a feather tucked behind one ear, and her eyes sparkled with the same recognition he felt inside himself. This day so long awaited, so full of tension, was not a beginning or an end, it was a continuation. And the presence of 400 warriors was not a challenge, but a promise. They had come to protect what had been sacred once and would be sacred again. Clara Whitmore had always been drawn to silence, not the lonely kind, but the kind that whispered truths between the words people rushed to say. It was this instinct, this desire to listen deeply, that led her to leave behind the bustle of city life, the whispers of disapproval from her family, and the safety of her boarding house in Kansas to journey west to Elijah Boone's valley. She had received his letters over the course of a year, slow, handwritten notes stained with trail dust, folded carefully, like they contained more than words, and in truth, they did. Elijah's letters spoke not only of longing and hope, but of land, of remembrance, and of a man shaped by solitude, not bitterness. Clara had been courted before, but no man had ever written to her about the way the sun touched pine bark in the early morning, or how silence could teach more than conversation. When Elijah had proposed marriage in his last letter, it had been, in the simplest terms, "Come if your heart leans west. Come if you're not afraid of the wind." It had moved her more than any poetry could have. She didn't need a wedding dress or lace-covered invitations. She needed only the courage to follow it, but her journey west turned out to be more than miles. It became a passage through stories, histories, and lives she'd never known she was part of. It began in the river town of Yankton, where she had boarded a supply wagon with a stern driver named Emery. After a few days on the trail, their small group encountered a Lakota family repairing a broken axle near the edge of a cottonwood grove. Emery had grumbled, hesitant, but Clara insisted they stop to help. She brought them water and offered spare rope from her kit. The woman she helped, a quiet grandmother named Howarte Winboot, full voice watched Clara with knowing eyes. "You are going to the valley," she said simply. Clara blinked. "Yes, I'm going to be married there." The woman nodded. "Then you should not travel alone." Over the next 3 days, the journey changed. Clara and her wagon were joined by 3 more Lakota families, traveling in parallel toward the sacred gathering near the ridge. No one had told her the gathering was taking place not in town, not in letters, but the people on the land seemed to know, as if the earth itself had whispered of it. Each night, Clara sat by the fire and listened. She heard stories about a man named Silas Boone, who had given food in the starving time. She learned of White Cloud, his wisdom, and how his grandson was now a respected elder among the people. The name Boone had not been forgotten. It had become part of oral tradition. One evening, while grinding herbs with the women, a young girl leaned close to Clara and asked, "Are you the woman marrying the quiet man?" Clara smiled. "I think I am." The girl giggled and ran to tell the others. By the time Clara reached the valley, she was not arriving as a stranger. She was arriving as someone expected. Viacaluda had sent riders ahead once he knew she was on the trail, ensuring her path was protected and her arrival honored. What Elijah had not seen, what would forever remain hidden in those soft footfalls behind the ridges, was how carefully the people had watched over her. She had not only crossed plains, she had crossed into the memory of a people, and she had done it without asking anything for herself. Now seated at the front of the wagon as the sea of warriors parted before her, Clara could feel the magnitude of it all. Her dress was simple, made from cotton and softened by travel. Her boots were scuffed, her braid was loose. But never in her life had she felt more beautiful, not because of appearance, but because of belonging. Elijah stood just ahead, hat still in hand, his figure tall and silent like the pines surrounding them. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Behind her, children tumbled from the wagons. Women stepped down with baskets and bundles. They were not guests to a wedding, they were its guardians. They carried more than supplies. They carried story, memory, and the invisible threads that stitched generations together. Clara's journey had started with a letter. It ended at the edge of a circle, beneath an open sky, where love was not just between 2 people, but between peoples. The sun hovered high above the valley, casting golden light over the circle formed by 400 native warriors, their families, and the lone white rancher, who now stood arm in arm with the woman he had waited so patiently for. In that quiet moment, it became clear to all that this was no ordinary wedding. There were no church bells, no white linens, and no minister in black robes, but there was a sacredness that filled the air thick and ancient as if the land itself held its breath. In reverence, Clara stepped down from the wagon with a grace Elijah had only imagined in his dreams. The hem of her dress brushed the wild grasses as she walked slowly toward him, her face calm but radiant. He noticed that she held something small and wrapped in red cloth. When she reached him, she offered it silently. Inside was a single eagle feather in a circle of carved wood, its surface etched with symbols Elijah didn't understand. "It was given to me by Howard Taywin," Clara said softly, "for both of us." She said it means strength, joined to understanding. Elijah nodded, unsure what to say. He wasn't used to ceremony. He had expected perhaps a private moment with Clara, a small vow beneath the cottonwoods. But the presence of the Lakota, hundreds of them, had changed everything. What had once been a personal promise now felt like the restoration of a legacy. Viacaluda raised his hand, and the crowd gathered more tightly around the clearing. From among the people, an elder woman stepped forward, dressed in a robe of elk hide, stitched with blue and white beads. She carried a bundle wrapped in deerskin and stood between Elijah and Clara. "This is not only a marriage," she announced, her voice deep and melodic. "It is a weaving. 2 lives, 2 bloodlines, 2 histories." She looked at Clara. "You have walked our lands. You have listened, not spoken first. That is the way of respect." She turned to Elijah. "And you, son of Silas Boone, are not forgotten." She opened the bundle and revealed 2 braided cords, one red, One white, slowly, she tied them together in a knot, then held the joined strands aloft. This is how the sky holds the sun and the moon, she said. Not always together, but always in balance. A low hum rose from the circle. It was not song exactly, but more like a chant, voices blending, not in words, but in feeling. It washed over the couple like wind over grass, soft and rhythmic. Then came the gifts. One by one, members of the tribe came forward, not to give lavish trinkets, but small, deeply symbolic items. A pouch of sweetgrass for peace, a carved buffalo horn for protection, a pair of moccasins worn by a child to remind them to walk gently. Elijah was overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness, the way every offering carried meaning beyond material value. Clara, too, received tokens. A necklace of turquoise and bone, a woven blanket meant for new beginnings, a piece of river stone, worn smooth from years in the current. One woman whispered as she gave it, "This is how you must hold your husband, strong, but not sharp." Elijah had seen many ceremonies over the years. He had seen weddings in town with pomp and lace, and funerals with sorrow masked behind stiff suits. But this gathering of land, language, memory, and future was different. It was as if time itself had bent inward for a moment to honor not just the couple, but the healing they represented. Finally, Viakaluta stood again and spoke directly to the crowd. "Let this be remembered. A man waited, a woman came, and between them, a path opened, not paved with conquest, but with remembrance. We do not forget those who fed us in winter, nor do we turn from those who walk toward us in peace." He placed one hand on Elijah's shoulder and one on Clara's. "You are husband and wife before the sky and the earth. Let this valley be your witness." There was no applause, no confetti, just the hush of wind and the cries of birds circling above, but in that silence, something sacred had been sealed, and neither Elijah nor Clara would ever forget it. After the ceremony, as the last echoes of chants faded into the hills, the valley seemed to exhale. What had been charged with tension and expectation now settled into something gentler, warmth, laughter, even playfulness. The warriors, once stern and silent, dismounted and mingled freely. Children ran barefoot through the grass. Fires were kindled, not for warning, but for food. Smoke lifted in soft spirals, carrying with it the aroma of roasted corn, bison stew, and sage. Clara stood beside Elijah, her hand in his, her eyes dancing as she watched the once empty ranch begin to transform. She had imagined living in isolation, learning to cook over a wood stove, tending a few chickens and goats, and speaking to Elijah in quiet tones under a wide sky. But this influx of people, of color, of culture, was not something she had expected, and yet it felt right. Viakaluta approached them again, now without his staff. He wore a faint smile, one that showed both pride and relief. "We will not stay long," he said, "but long enough to bless the land again. Your father built it with good hands. You will do the same." Elijah nodded. "I hope so." The elder's gaze lingered. "No," he said gently, "you must, for this place now belongs not only to you, but to all who remember." With that, Viakaluta stepped away to help oversee the planting of 3 young trees near the river's bindi, one blessed with a handful of cornmeal and a whispered prayer. It was an old ritual, Clara was told, done whenever something new was born, a child, a peace, or a promise. As the evening unfolded, a rhythm took shape. Blankets were laid out. Food was shared. Clara found herself seated among the women, learning how to grind berries into paste and twist sinew for thread. She laughed with them first shyly, then freely as they teased her about the life ahead. "He looks like he doesn't talk much." One woman grinned, "But that means you get the last word." Elijah, meanwhile, was surrounded by men, not in judgment or challenge, but in camaraderie. They asked about the land, how he managed the cattle, where he drew water, how many winters he'd survived alone. He spoke little, but when he did, they listened. Respect in their culture, he was learning, came not from boasting but from presence, and Elijah had been present for a long time. By dusk, the valley felt like a different place. The air was still the same, the hills hadn't moved, but something had shifted in the way the ranch sat on the land, not like a solitary outpost, but like a bridge, a place where the past and future could shake hands. Clara stood on the porch, looking out over the scene. Fires dotted the meadow like stars had fallen to earth. She saw children curled up under blankets, their laughter now whispers as sleep took them. She saw warriors sharing pipes and quiet words beneath the cottonwoods. She saw Elijah walking slowly with an elder, pointing toward the barn, likely talking about repairs. She figured, and she felt it again, that deep certainty. This wasn't just her new home. It was the right home. Inside the cabin, she began to arrange the few belongings she had brought: books, letters, a carved box from her mother. But what she cherished most was what she had unpacked herself, the feather and carved circle that Viakaluta had placed on their windowsill before sunset. A symbol, he had told her, of balance, of 2 sides, 2 truths, living as one. She turned as Elijah stepped into the doorway. His hat was in his hands, his boots dusty, his shoulders tired, but there was a light in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not the weariness of a man who had waited too long, but the peace of a man who finally understood why he had waited at all. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess we've got a full house tonight." Clara smiled. "And a full heart." Outside, the night wrapped the valley in silence again, not empty this time, but full. The kind of silence that follows something sacred, the kind that comes after a long wait. When you finally know you're home. Seasons passed, and the valley remembered. The great gathering slowly dispersed, as all sacred things do, not with fanfare, but with quiet dignity. The warriors rode out one morning, not in a single thunderous wave as they had arrived, but in smaller groups, leaving behind trails of tobacco offerings and smooth stones placed along the creek. The elders left last, walking the land one final time, whispering blessings into the soil. Viacaluda touched the doorframe of Elijah and Clara's cabin before he left, pressing his palm flat against the wood. He said nothing, but Clara felt his meaning like thunder beneath her ribs. After that, life on the ranch resumed, though it would never again be ordinary. Elijah built a second cabin not far from the first. It was for guests, he said, but everyone knew what he meant. He added more stalls to the barn and widened the path toward the eastern ridge, making it easier for visitors to come down from the mountains. He never said the word welcome, but it was stitched into every fence post. Every trail cleared, every pot of stew left, simmering just in case someone appeared unannounced. Lara, too, grew roots. She planted a garden near the kitchen window, lining it with stones she and the local children collected from the creek bed. She learned how to tan hides, how to tell the difference between good snow and dangerous snow, how to sing lullabies in a tongue she didn't grow up with. She wasn't Lakota by blood but by love, by effort, and by humility. She became part of their rhythm, and they accepted her. Children began to refer to the place as the Two-Spirit House, not for the gendered term, but for the idea that two hearts, two stories, could live in harmony without losing themselves. There were stories told around fires about the silent man who once waited with his heart open like a field and the brave woman who crossed rivers to answer. Even those who had never seen them felt like they knew them. Their love, quiet as it was, rippled through oral tradition. But time, as always, moved forward. Years passed. Clara's hair grayed, then turned silver. Elijah's hands, once strong enough to break wild colts, now shook gently as he carved. They walked slower, but never stopped walking. Each spring, they returned to the 3 trees planted near the river, now tall and sheltering. There, they placed offerings, corn, cedar, a woven cord, and every year, someone else joined them. Sometimes an elder, sometimes a child, sometimes an entire family on horseback. They never advertised. They never sent letters, but the valley always knew when to gather again. One particularly harsh winter, the snow came early and heavy. For weeks, the trail into the valley was buried. Elijah and Clara, now well into their later years, did what they had always done. The fire, shared stories, waited. They were prepared to endure it alone, as they had endured many things, but they didn't have to. One morning, just as the snow began to lighten, riders appeared along the ridge, at first just 1, then 3, then 10, until nearly 30 people descended, carrying firewood, dried meat, herbs, and laughter. Among them were the grandchildren of those original warriors, and with them came a new drum, newly painted, its hide stretched with reverence. No one told them to come. They just knew. Clara wept as she stirred soup that night, not out of sorrow, but from the sheer beauty of being remembered, of mattering in a world that often forgets the quiet ones. Elijah said little, but later that evening, he carved a small figure from pine and placed it above the doorway, a circle joined by 2 braided cords. When they eventually passed Clara first, then Elijah, just a few moons later, they did so as part of the land, not apart from it. Their graves were placed side by side beneath the trees, their names etched into river stones, not marble. No need for grandeur. The valley itself would remember, and it did. Long after their cabin faded and the fences wore down, people still came. They came not for relics, but for what could only be felt, the echo of vows not spoken loudly, but lived daily. The kind of love that doesn't demand to be seen, only understood. So the land held them, as it held the stories, the silence, and the song. And in that quiet place, between the rise of the hills and the bend of the creek, the wind still carries a name, Boone.